we are here today with Chris Church, president of MacroFab. I am so thrilled to have you join us today. Thank you for being here, Chris.
Absolutely, Jackie. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoy being on the We podcast when I have the opportunity.
Well, we're in for a ride today because we have a lot of things to talk about. But before we do, let me just, turn it over to you, Chris, to describe what does MacroFab do? How are you connected in the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So at MacroFab, we're a digital electronics manufacturing platform. We work primarily with high-mix, low-volume customers to give them a self-service experience around electronics manufacturing. So what I mean by that is a customer can come to us, take their design files, upload them into our platform. They get instantaneously priced. They're able to then order that, whether it's a quick turn time or a longer turn time. And then we work both with factories we own and factories that are partners of ours and enable them to utilize their excess capacity. So we exist in a kind of a unique space where we focus on enabling self-service and providing a marketplace-like access to electronics manufacturing for small to mid-sized volume production.
Nice. Very needed and a really good niche in the supply chain at this time. So would love to talk to you because in the role that you serve, you have a really good bird's eye view into the supply chain. And we've actually utilized you before to speak at our events and conferences. I really actually love your overview, your recommendations, how you see supply chain, the repositioning of supply chain, some best practices. What are people doing? What's working? So anyway, we're going to have a great discussion today. We'll talk about that among other things. So let's get started. First and foremost, obviously what's hot topic on everybody's mind is AI, right? Like how do we not address AI? And it's moving fast. It's moving super fast. I think a lot of people can have discussions about AI, but what are the really effective discussions? Because really we have to rethink how we're utilizing this and what we think about AI in our businesses. We really have to get down to some real business solutions and conversations as we're moving forward, right? So let's just start with the basics. Up until this point, right? At this point, everybody's using ChatGPT or whatever basic tools. But how are you as a business owner looking at AI as more than a research tool, as more of a fundamental part of your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really helpful. I know a lot of our audience is very familiar with this, but to think about the kind of the stages where we have been and where we are now, and to reflect on that inflection point, what has changed between those two states. And I think a lot of companies are still right now thinking about where we were with AI about a year ago, right? Sort of that interactive search, right? This is what ChatGPT is great at. You can go and discover about a subject and ask questions and get a lot of information. A year or two ago, they called it RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, was like the big thing, right? So go through all these documents, find the useful information I need, and return me that link to that document. At the same time, companies were also using these LLMs to create domain-specific search and information models, right? And, we've done that as well, whether it's combining machine learning and the LLMs or just LLMs that are specifically trained. That's kind of like last time I had a major conversation with anybody in the electronics industry. It was all focused on what is our data, how do we get better insights into our data. The real change I think that's happened, and this really started happening, I guess, as recently as November and December. So this is a very fast change that's just upon us, is thinking through the world through an agentic AI lens. So this is not about the retrieval and the search alone. This is now the AI tools designed to act on our behalf. And this, obviously the first impact is on software development because, we're not only, we've had some of these abilities for a while, but now they're working so amazingly well. I think Anthropic really drove that with Sonnet and Opus. those models were just kind of really moved the bar up. Google caught up with Gemini. Gemini's excellent as well. But thinking about, and I'll give you as an example, right? I needed to update the commission system for our sellers in Salesforce, right? And we had been using a third, independently developed different tool. Before I would have ChatGPT or something write the code for me, then I've got to go deploy it into there. I've got to validate that it works. Now when I'm doing it, I'm telling it to make that change, it goes and deploys to the Salesforce sandbox on its own. It reads the response coming from Salesforce, sees the errors it makes, and fixes it and feeds it back. So that's that first step. But now what we're seeing is there's a standard called Model Context Protocol, MCP, that enables us to create services that AI LLMs can talk to. And these are our internal business systems. So things like NetSuite has one, Atlassian for Confluence and Jira has one, right? You have all of these different systems out there. And that allows me to not have to train the model, but now the agent can actually go and query those systems, find information that my user has access to, and then take action, whether it's go and send an email, write a new document and email it to somebody. So what is happening there? These were tools that were primarily leveraged for our software development teams to add features to our products, or our IT teams to add new tools. And now they're transitioning into the hands of everyday business people to think about how they optimize their day and utilize tools to do the things that take their time, but don't really in and of themselves add value, right? So I was playing around this morning with Claude Cowork because that just came out, right? And this stuff is, I gotta be honest with you, I'm really excited about this, right? These are sort of like conversations we're having here internally. I had a request that I combine a bunch of PDFs or PowerPoints that our teams produce every week and send it out as one combined PowerPoint. Let Claude Cowork do it for me. I'm not going to spend 30 minutes out of my week doing that, right? Hold it, took 5 minutes telling it what to do, gave it access to the files, and now I have it run it for me every week, right? And I've just gained that much more time back in my day. So that's kind of where we are, and thinking as business owners, these are the conversations we're having internally within our teams as well, is look at the processes that we're dealing with on a daily basis. Think about every person in every team. How much time is spent doing things which simply further the process or execute the process, and how much time is spent delivering value either to the business or the customer, right? And look at those things where like, okay, if I go through and I have to check these 5 boxes and fill out this form every time this happens, that's our first target for getting an agent to do something for us, right? Because that is not providing any value. It's simply executing, doing what we have to do to keep the business running. And so thinking about with other business owners and all that, like how do we look at our business and think through how we communicate to the team, how do we give them those tools, and how do we enable them to look at their own processes and find opportunities for improvement.
Oh, there's so much to this conversation. First of all, I'm curious because I didn't know that new version just came out of Claude. So I'm actually going to play with it after I get off with you. But if you could pick, okay, so you're implementing these tools into your organization. I'm going to ask you a question about your favorite tools. But before I do that, the question to preface it is, if we have these agents doing these workflows for us, where's the accountability, right? Like what if something goes wrong? That's one thing that I would be thinking of in setting up any of these tools. How do we design an accountability? So have you thought through that?
Yeah, the short answer is the person who owns the task is still accountable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, this should be a refreshing opportunity for many people in their role to actually start taking control back, right? Because historically, and I think one of the most important things about the agentic AI and MCP servers and all of this, right, is before we could have automated all of those things. right? We would go to a development or an IT team, we'd get it on their priority list, they would write code, and it would work most of the time. And when it didn't work, we'd say, it's not my fault, it's the
Hmm.
developer's fault. But now, by bringing it back into the person who owns that thing and giving them the tools, and why it's so much different is I don't have to say, I don't have to know how to write the code, right? I don't have to do that. I have to simply say, here is what I'm expecting to happen. And what I find is people get better and better at explaining that and understanding what can go wrong and putting guardrails and doing that. But it's now in the hands of the people who own that task every day, who own that part of the business. And they no longer have this, well, so and so or that team has prevented me from being successful. It puts
Yeah.
the power back in their hands. Now,
Yeah.
they have to be willing to take that, right? They have to be willing to learn, willing to take that risk, and the organization has to give them that opportunity.
Well, I feel like this is one of the most key points because people have to start learning the tools in order to take accountability for their job utilizing the tools. And, everyone's got to be a technical person to some degree at this stage. And if you're not willing to continually evolve, grow, change the tools, upgrade, probably not the best, right, to be in this line of work, right? I mean, it's,
Yeah, I mean, that opens up I think, a big can of worms, right?
yes,
So, you know, if I were looking back 5, 10 years ago, the fear was robots were going to replace people working on manufacturing lines,
right.
right? But knowledge workers, office workers, they were always going to be needed. Now, what the AI, call it revolution or evolution, is teaching us, right, is there's a strong distinction in knowledge and white collar workers between those who can execute a process and those who can build and orchestrate a process, right? And that's where the value is really starting to come in. It's not just the tools, because you can know the tools, you can know how to configure them, you can know how to run them, but do you know how to effectively communicate? And this
Mm,
one thing we talk about is we think about the AI as the most eager and junior software developer you've ever worked with in your life. You have
mm,
to listen. You have to understand and know where it's misleading you and where you're misleading it, and get good at that and know how all these things connect. And I think it's really just doing it. You don't have to start with work stuff. You can start with home stuff, right? I want to go search for, I want to create a grocery list, and I want you to go find 5 recipes, and these are the ingredients I'm allergic to, and these are the things that I don't like cooking and I don't like eating. Now,
mhm.
a grocery list and a meal plan for this week. Things like that to start. It teaches us how to do that before we have to bring it into the work environment.
Yep. I think it's a great. So before I get into, I want to ask you about analytics and start applying these tools. But what are some of your favorite tools that you are all seeing that are working well right now?
You know, depending on where we're at in the organization and who's doing what, it's all very different, right? If I were to talk to my development team, they're going to be very very fond of Gemini, the LLMs from Gemini, the LLMs from Anthropic. Half of them are going to be focused on GitHub Copilot and using things like Visual Studio. The other half are going to be using something like Pi or Claude Code on the terminal, right? Not actually writing any code themselves. Within the team, I've found, outside of that group, Claude is one of our favorites. We've been trying different tools. It just works better for most people. It gives them the right mix of capabilities and the right mix of guardrails. They're, I'm excited about things that have come out recently, like they call it OpenClaw now, but it was called Moltbot if you were watching the news very recently. Claudebot, these totally autonomous AI bots, agents that were out there. It's an exciting area. I wouldn't even begin to think of using those things, right? The risks are too high. But I think there's a lot going on right now. that enable us to do more faster, even if we're not strongly technical, right? If we have a good technical background, we can take in those tools faster. But I found even very non-technical people can pick them up pretty quickly as long as with guidance. And if I were to start somewhere right now, it'd be something like Claude Teams. You've got the data protection. It's not particularly expensive. You've got a lot of connectors. So if you're a Microsoft organization or a Google organization, you've got your MCP servers are built in for that, and they're ready to run.
Well, I'm going to check it out. That's one of the ones we haven't been using, so I'm going to check it out. And now let's go into some of the data side. So, there's so much to our industry. Holy moly. I'm sure you're using some of the tools for your data analytics. But really, I mean, in this day and age, I just don't think we should be looking at data like we always have in the past. And how are you pulling it? But what's the mindset behind collecting the data, not using maybe just a single source? What is your best practices? Because we're a data-driven industry, right? Everybody's looking at data. So let me ask you that, because this is I think something everybody's struggling with.
Yeah. So, data is, I'll put it at a very high level, right? We follow very traditional patterns. We have a data lake with every system feeding into it. Then, of course, there are all of the what we call the extract, transform, load, the ETL work cases are looking at things like sensitivity of the data, the level of access should be allowed, and we have some of those traditional tools. I'm starting to move more away from that as we move into the AI world. We use it still, and we will be continuing to use that kind of model for a very long time because it's very powerful and very fast once you know what you're doing and what you're looking for. We're starting to teach more people to utilize their AI systems to query systems directly and then start to put the information together. Because we find in a lot of cases, they understand the system they work with every day better than they understand a data schema in a data lake, right? And that was, for every company, that's always really the challenge. You can populate all the data in there, then you have to pay somebody to show people all the patterns. How do you get the information you need and all? So, we've done that, but we started moving away from preparing those data patterns in the data lakes and having everybody be sort of an expert in the systems they work with and understanding those, and relying on we would call it like a sort of an agents ND or a guideline file for another system that they're unfamiliar with, right? That tells that tool how to map the data between the two systems, right? We kind of even get to the point where we tell the AI to go generate that mapping for us, right? Just this morning, I had someone ask a question about a system. I said, okay, there's documentation out there in one of our systems on how we translated that information. Read the documentation and create the guidelines for how to query in their language to this system, right?
Wow.
It was pretty effective, right? So that's where we're starting to push people to, but it doesn't really matter how we get the data or where the data is. It matters what data we're looking at, why it's the data we're looking at, and the periodicity, how often we look at that data. So, within our organization, what we really talk about the metrics that matter, right? What are, if you're very top level, if you think about it, there's some top level grow revenue, right? Our revenue should be X this year. Well, what are the next 3 metrics that are most impactful to that, right? And are you looking at those every day? And you keep going down one step until you get to the point where all of this becomes noise, and maybe there are 5 or 6 things you look at every day, and another 5 you look at every week, and another 5 you look at every month, right? And so that becomes that focus that you're able to express exactly why this metric is one of the most important ones in the business, and then inside and out, and you watch it constantly, because those changes, right? That's what we want to be. Is we want to, you and I have talked about this in the past, and I think this is really important. We have to understand what is causing changes, right? We run experiments, we do things. Sometimes people do stuff without us even knowing it, and all of a sudden something's starting to change in our outcomes. So Are we aware enough of what's happening every day in those key metrics? Have we instrumented them in such a way that we can roll them forward as well? So this is one thing we use here in particular is you create models of how things are supposed to go, and then you have your actual performance. And then your future is always projected by the actual performance updating the model in real time. So you could see, if I keep doing what I'm doing today, this is my outcome. And then is that on or off track? Right? And if it's show that trend, you very quickly go back and say what's changing that.
That's really good. Well, okay. Before I'll ask you one more question about this, because I do find it's very fascinating because we get so entrenched with data. And I really do appreciate that you said that everybody's kind of in charge of analyzing their own data. I actually really like that a lot. I notice a lot of people say it's easy to collect the data, but then what do you do with it and how do you analyze it and how do you make it effective? Like, the goal is not just to collect data. The goal is to do something with it and have a useful tool. But how are you building all this analytical thinking, not creating the data scientists, but how is it that you're getting people to do this? Because this is not, if somebody's not used to doing that, it's a kind of a new skill that a lot of people are learning at this time. So how are you doing that?
I think as leaders, we have to help and enable the teams. Our teams do that, right? And I recently, I did some changing around the structure of our organization, and that brought a lot of new people into roles where they weren't there before. And one of the first things I went through with them is like, look, this is what I expect from you on a weekly, monthly basis. And I understand you haven't done this before. So I'm going to help you your first time.
Yep.
The first month or so, we're going to go through this every week. I'm going to help you structure, you're going to be comfortable in Excel. So I'm going to start with Excel for you, right? We're going to structure everything in Excel. And we're going to talk about, what things you need to update every day in there. And then we're going to talk about how you think about what you're seeing. But we're going to do that briefly. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to start asking you questions, right? So, I do this with my team. I say, hey, I'm looking at one of your reports and I see this number has changed. Why do you think that's happened? Okay. Now, what do you think happens if we stay here? Yeah, can you show me how you can express to me what's going to happen if we stay at this point? Go ahead. Think about, setting up your data in Excel, show it to me, right? Or whatever tool we're using for that person's comfortable with. And then go, okay, now how do you change that outcome? And you get to think about that, right? Because it's not, everybody gets really infatuated with their reports. This is the thing I've learned, right? Especially if you get a room full of executives, they have graphs and PowerPoints and look at all my data. The best people in the room are storytellers.
Yeah.
Data shows up and they're like, let me tell you what you need to know about this data, right? So for me, the question is how do you turn all of these people into storytellers, right? Not say, here's the trend, here's the report, but this is why the trend is happening. This is what you need to know. That's top 3 most important things you need to know. And here's the thing that I'm going to be doing to change that outcome, right? Getting everybody in that mode, it takes time. But our jobs as leaders are to work with our teams and get them there. And do it whatever tooling that they're most comfortable with now, and only try to take them off of that if it's not really going to meet their needs. Because the hardest thing is you've got to train everybody to use basic tools like Excel or Power BI, or we have Noe is one of the systems we use, right? If you're going to use one of those systems, Salesforce, and they know that, okay, let's stick to the system until it doesn't meet our needs anymore.
I love that. I actually am going to implement that, is doing the storytelling. Actually, I'm going to utilize that from our board meeting coming up this week. I need to be a better storyteller. So that's very useful, Chris. But okay, so let me get into, I have a couple other questions for you that we'll get into more nitty gritty with supply chain and things like that going on. But before we do, just since, we're on the AI topic, with what we do at We United, and obviously dedicated to leadership development, and just leadership in general around the ecosystem. But part of that is really understanding in AI, what are the biases and how is it that each of us are responsible or can pay attention in whatever role we play in bias in AI. I personally have a little pause with this because I understand and know that AI layers on top of digital technology. Like anything that's in the ecosystem is what the AI is layered on top of. So if we know that there are some already existing biases in our digital technology, what do we do, Chris, from this point? Is this something that's going to help that at some level with the AI? Is there a way we could do that, or is just going to further cement biases? Like, what are your thoughts about that? Is in your role?
Yeah. So, I think if we understand the causes of this, right? So, an LLM, a large language model, is an encapsulation of culture, the culture it's been trained with, right? It is a pattern matching engine. It is going to regurgitate the most common patterns, which works really great if I'm talking about accounting, right? Or writing code.
Yes.
If the most vocal people on the internet are saying very bad things about other people, now it takes effort, right? Because that culture is self-enforcing. That culture is self-replicating, right? And it's going to affect everything we do. Now, people take action to push that in a different direction, and the LLM teams are doing a lot of work there. And that's, I would say, understanding where the state of that is way outside of my remit. So I'm going to try to avoid that, but bring it back to the same reflection in our own organizations. What is the culture of our organization? Well, we often talk about, business processes follow the communication architecture of the business, right? So if you have a very top-down business, your processes are going to be very top-down. If you have a very flat organization, your processes are going to look a lot more inefficient and kind of scattershot because it's, modeling those direct people-to-people connections.
Mm-hmm.
If our concerns are that, there's going to be a negative cultural impact that we create some, significantly impacting biases that would prevent someone of a particular gender or color or anyone of a particular background from not being able to succeed, that's a function of our culture first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
That we have to make sure that our culture is aligned first, because the tools are just going to do what we do, right?
Yeah.
If I give, we talked earlier about empowering every person who's an actor in the day-to-day operation of the business to automate parts of their task, they're going to do it the same way that they're doing it today, right? Which means any biases, any issues, any, I would like to say, kind of pre-negative outcomes, right, that are baked into that are going to show up in those systems. So we have to think, as we're training people how to use them, right, how to be free to step out of that culture a little bit and think about new ways. And maybe even empower the people, the voices, because you're going to have to train people, right? Not everyone's just going to pick these tools up and run with them and be successful. So if you pick the people who help train them to be aware of those things and help give them guidance, you can't just come in there and say, don't do these things because they're going to create more bias, but say, hey, when you do that way, what do you think the outcome of that is, right? And we need the right people in the organization to be there with teams as they're learning to do that, to ensure that we're not promoting those existing biases or even exacerbating them in a lot of cases.
It's a great point, and it's a really good moment for anybody, running organizations and management roles, to be thinking that culture is directly tied in with the AI conversation, with the workflows. Everything has to be connected. Everything has to be looked at holistically, right? And thoughtful, intentional. if for the best profits of the organization.
Mhm.
So, okay. So I do want to talk to you about some more dig in stuff, because this is where, your area of expertise is really the supply chain and repositioning of supply chains and what are you seeing everywhere. But I'm going to just start, as we're navigating lots of geopolitical issues, right? There's
Mhm.
volatility. There's going to be, let's just level set. I would assume most people at this point, when they're designing in, they're not relying on just a single source of parts. And let's hope that they're relying on more. But I don't know, maybe you could speak to that real quick. And what are you seeing in this regard?
So there are a couple things that we want to help set the stage with, right? Because I think when I talked at the conference, just last year, one of the things I cautioned about was the potential for, we call it balkanization, right? Creating kind of walled in regional areas for manufacturing. I don't think we're seeing less of that, right? I think we're
Oh,
seeing that accelerate, maybe potentially at a rate faster than we thought. This
wow.
is something that, I thought we were going to really start seeing the first signs of 5, 10 years from now, slowly marching towards it. I think, we see with the restructuring of the relationship between the EU and the US, Canada and the US, others, I think some of this is going to happen much faster, right?
Wow.
That markets are going to be more constrained about where their products can come from, and it's going to be less about, optimizing the productivity and profitability of business, and more about managing geopolitical relationships. So I have some serious concerns that process may be accelerating.
Mm.
And, I have not been heartened by what I've seen just this week with the US and the EU, right? There's some long-term implications to the way people are speaking and interacting that I think will impact us. I don't think our relationships with, in particular for companies in the US, Southeast Asia is not getting better. It's
Yeah.
getting more fragile, which is not to say it's the end of the world, but it's gonna be a little less predictable and a little less reliable over time. So knowing that we're seeing that, we are actually seeing India stepping up. I was really
Mm.
concerned about them 6 months ago. I didn't know if they were going to be able to make the right moves to start, creating the right market relationships and the right trade policies that would enable them to take a bigger role on the international stage, especially with respect to electronics. We are seeing that now, so I'm a little more heartened in India. There's still a lot of risk there, but I think they're going in the right direction, and they're going to be able to achieve some of that.
Mm.
So for us, especially in the U.S. and North America, that is going to become more of an option for us. It's been an
Mm.
option, but I think it's going to become more available, and we're going to see more transition from Southeast Asia and East Asia into India over time. They need to maintain that, right? There's a lot of work that can happen there. So that's kind of on the geopolitical front. Now, with that single sourcing, I don't think that people always realize how single source they are, right? The
Mm.
critical IP, it runs on a microprocessor that is built in one plant in Taiwan, right? That's the concern. It's not who sells it. Can I buy it from 5 distributors? Sure, but it's all being made in the same plant in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Right? Can that be moved to a fab in the U.S.? Potentially, yes. Right? Will it be? How critical is it to the rest of the
Mm.
U.S. national defense level criticality, or is it a consumer product level criticality? That's going to have a big distinction there. So,
Mm.
one of the things I often, having worked with engineers quite a bit, is to think about from a product perspective. You've got a good product. You built it. It works great. Right? What happens if I can't source that chip? Well, we'll have to go back and redesign it. Well, can you design me a variant now that may have fewer features, right? That may be not fully tested, but we have it already in our pocket.
Yeah.
That I think is going to become a little more important over time. We see some companies, if you're a big company, if you're Apple, if you're a big Fortune 100 company, Fortune 500 company, you have a lot more flexibility, right? Because you spend so much, and you can go out there and move the market in the ways that a $50 million company cannot, right? So you have to understand where you are on the totem pole, both with your individual manufacturers, with the overall supply chain, and then think about, as things become more and more balkanized, where are your biggest centers of risk, and are you able to adapt and build variants around those so that you're not waiting? We see people all the time. People come to us and they're like, "Hey, I got this great product. Okay, well, one of the chips has a 40-week lead time." They're like, "Great. I really need this product in a month, so why don't you go ahead and figure out get that for me?" I'm like, "No, I don't think you understand. For you and for me and for everyone else here, it has a 40-week lead time." There you go, right? That cannot. Yep. Is a fact of this is pure physics. I can't change this on you, right? What was your alternative strategy? Oh, I don't have one. Now, if you want it faster, is to start a redesign process. So, get that information in earlier in your design phase. If you're an engineer, product engineer, an electrical engineer, if you're a procurement person, identify where the risk is, potentially some pre-buying or making some commitments with the manufacturer. If you have enough demand to be able to facilitate that. But most of the purchasing people we know, of course, because we live, we're in the industry we live, we're mostly dealing with people who are building turnkey. They're trying to offset that to their contract manufacturers. Larger companies, right? They're going to manage more of that supply chain themselves. They can do better planning and purchasing management. But with smaller companies, they're going turnkey. They're used to someone else doing all that for them. So they're going to need to start asking those questions, I think, of their manufacturer at the end of the day. Where are my risks, right? What are you guys seeing out there? And where should I focus my attention to avoid supply chain disruption in 6 months, a year, or 2 years from now?
So basically what you're saying is like the best strategy right now is start your redesign just in case. What's your plan B? What's your plan C, right? I mean, you've got to have that unless you can wait 40 weeks.
Right. On top of that, right, let's combine all of that with AI tools. Yeah. There are AI-based, circuit design tools that can quickly, spin a variant of a chip in. The firmware and software development for less complex stuff, the AI tools can work that faster, right? So we have the ability to respond. Now, I'm not saying those tools are going to solve those problems for us. They're not going to pick the right parts. They're not always going to write the right functionality for us, but they reduce the cost of spinning up that variant, right? They reduce the time to spin up that variant, and therefore, reduce the reasons why we wouldn't do that in our normal process.
The other thing, it's an interesting conversation because we're talking about AI, we're talking about manufacturing, supply chain, all this stuff. But, it's really interesting because, we do excel here in high value manufacturing, as you and I have talked about before. We struggle with commodity production, but we also struggle with getting enough the roles, the jobs filled, right? Right? So I don't know. I just wanted to talk about that as well, because man, if you look at the challenges in supply chain, there's been tariffs, geopolitical factors, AI, I mean, you name it, you go down the line. What is it that you see right now? If you're looking at all of these factors, what's the real challenge? What's the real challenge to manufacturing right now, taking all of this into consideration, especially with talent?
Yeah. So I think, you hit on that first great point there that, as an economy advances and the wages go up, we saw it in the US, we've seen this in China, we're seeing this everywhere, right? Where you have these rapid developing economies. As the wages go up, the value add in manufacturing has to go up as well for that labor, right? Simply because a person, if the minimum wage is $20 an hour, it's $20 an hour, right? You cannot make it $5 for that hour of input.
Right.
And the product only gets $5 of value out of that hour of input. You've lost dollars, right? So
Yeah.
that's that trend that drives us that way. And this happened in America, and I think we've noticed the United States is a huge manufacturing economy. It is. I don't have all the numbers in front of me, right? So I don't want to be caught saying the wrong thing, but we do a ton of manufacturing here, both electronics and other things, but it tends to be in higher value
Yes.
products, right? That's simply because, we have to pay people health insurance, right? We have to, it costs money to, borrow money to buy machines. All of that has to produce more value than the input cost going in. And so as we think, kind of forward with what's happening today, we see short-term policies trying to drive long-term change. It's not going to happen in the short term. Right.
Hmm.
At a very fundamental level, I think you hit on that. People, availability of jobs and people, open positions is, if I look at, if we look at, say, January of 2025, right, there were about 450,000 open manufacturing jobs that hadn't been filled, right? We look at December of 2025, it's 415,000. So, you know, we're not seeing a huge change,
Wow.
right? And in fact, the openings have gone down by 7%. You go, great. Well, there's a lot more people are employed now. No, actually, the number of people employed in manufacturing have gone down by 0.5% over that.
Wow.
So what's really happened with the policies that have been enacted, we picked new winners and new losers.
Hmm.
Net result is we still have about as many open positions as we had before that are unfilled and need to be filled, but now there are fewer people working in manufacturing. We have to go solve that problem.
Wow.
Uh, you know, if we have to ask, why don't people want to go fill those jobs? We talk about how we want to bring back manufacturing, but when we have so many open jobs and so many people unemployed, I think roughly the last I looked, just looking at the working age male portion of the population, which tends to be the traditional manufacturing workers, there were 7 million working age males in the United States that had simply left the job market.
Wow.
How do we get into that position? Right.
Wow.
We're not going to tariff our way to solving that. We really need to encourage people that there is value in manufacturing as a job, that it is interesting work, that it is worthwhile work. I know for a long time we had, kind of convinced people that all those, blue collar jobs were, nobody wants that. You're not successful unless you're a lawyer, a doctor, you got this, you got that.
Mhm.
But these are the things our economy runs on. That's things our lives run on, right? So how
Yes.
do you make that attractive? I don't think you can't change that in a year, right? But that's what we need to be focused
Oh my goodness, these are amazing comments. And really, I like you kind of mentioned like incentives.
on.
There really has to be more incentives,
Mhm.
right, to get
Wow.
into manufacturing for organizations. You know, you said it before, and when we talked before, you were saying tariffs alone don't reshore, right? You need predictability, you need tax
Mhm.
incentives, you need long-term investment
Right.
into this space, right? And I think that's what you're getting at here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if we're going to spin up a new factory, that is a huge capital expense, right?
Yes.
And I want that. If I'm gonna have to depreciate it over 10 years, right? I have to think about at least 10 years of operating that business. And do I have a stable environment to do that in? Can I predict that I'm going to have the business I need? And that's where I'm hoping we'll see more out of. Is not just as I like to say to people, not just stick. We need some carrot in there too, right? Uh,
Mm.
Give people a reason to believe that this is a long-term valuable thing, not just worry about the short-term risk of not doing it.
Oh man, I wish we had a lot more time to talk about this because I think that's an excellent point that you just concluded with. And really, I can't believe how fast these podcasts go. We've been talking almost 45 minutes, and I could talk to you a lot longer, Chris, because I think you made some really excellent points. But to conclude the interview, from your role, your position, everything we just talked about, what are some final thoughts to business, drivers driving organizations in manufacturing, distribution, and throughout the supply chain? What are some final thoughts you have for them?
Yeah, so one of the thoughts I want to have is the world is changing very rapidly, whether it's the geopolitical side, whether it's the tariff and the supply chain side, or the AI. The smaller your company is, the faster you need to be reacting to all of those things. A very large company, if you're a 10, $20 billion a year company, you've got a lot of inertia. You're not going to see negative effects from not reacting to those and trying to stay ahead of those changes for several years. And then they're going to do it all at once. But the small companies are going to feel it in the next 12 months, right? They're going to be out-competed by more nimble organizations. There's going to be new competitors popping up because the cost of entry is much lower than it was before. So, my key takeaway here is, or that I'd hope people would take away from this, is depending on the size of your organization, it determines how quickly and how agile you have to be. The big organizations still have to get there, but they can ride it out a little bit longer, right? They have more time to react to it. Still, big organizations, whoever moves fastest is gonna, see the improvements compound the quickest. But if you're in a smaller company right now, you need to be asking yourself, how am I utilizing the latest, innovations in AI? How is my team thinking about the business itself? How am I engaging and training everyone here? And how do I get more people to even want to work with us every day? How do I make these jobs I have attractive?
Really great final comments, and really always thinking about that culture and who you want working with you and how you want to be doing the work. So Chris, I really appreciate you being here. We're having just a shout out, also we're having our We United Summit October 6th through 10th. I'll hit you up to maybe come join us again. It wouldn't be the same without you.
I look forward to it. I always enjoy a chance to get out to somewhere nice and pretty in the middle of the early parts of the fall when it's still very hot here in Houston.
Yes, exactly. Well, good to see you as usual, Chris, and thank you for joining us today.